Hello, everyone. Welcome to this fireside chat at the end of the first day of the fourth Money View Symposium. We are kind of repeating a fireside discussion I had with Perry 3 years ago, trying to trace down the intellectual foundations of important people behind our endeavor here. And I'm very glad, as one of the first interviews done for the YSI, I participated in interviewing Katharina Pistor in Toronto in the autumn of 2012, if I'm correct, a few months after the YSI started in Berlin in the spring, where I actually first heard her talk, and I encourage the new young scholars to look it up on the YouTube channel. But since then, a lot of things have happened, and the legal theory of finance was kind of presented on this Toronto event. And 5 years ago, the Code of Capital, the book that made Katharina Pistor, I think, kind of famous in the financial world and went around the globe, and you can find very many podcasts and discussion about that, is in a way, I think, linked to the money view of that is linked to Perry, but has an older tradition. And that's why I had this idea of try to walk through the intellectual influences of Katharina, and try to then in the end link the money view and the legal theory of finance and the Code of Capital and her current work in the end, follow the thought process and see whether this try to find out in the end if Katharina actually is a money viewer like most of the people on this talk, or if she's a important add-on to the Money View Fellowship to extend it from the economic history and history of economic thought towards the legal scholars and what she is trying to do with transforming the global legal framework and the capitalist framework. If I understood correctly what's happening in her current work on the hopefully upcoming next book. But Perry has taught us that books are 7 years in the making. So within this or next 2 years, maybe that is something we can hope for. But after this short introduction, Katharina, I mean, I'm thinking from the introduction, the intellectual influence that brought you to the place where you are now. I have heard you talk about your influence from both Chinese law and Soviet legal system. So if you can maybe in the beginning, tell us your path through studies, from Freiburg in Germany, going through London, back to Hamburg, to Harvard, where I know you studied Master of Public Administration, and then back to Munich. So a brief overview of where you come from and how you ended up where you are.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for hosting me. It's really a wonderful honor to speak to all of you in this context of the Money View conference. So, I think it's always easy with hindsight to paint like a relatively straight path forward. But in truth, of course, things are a bit more complicated. So one wanders around and tries to make sense of the world. And at some point, something clicks and you think you have something to say. But if I'm looking back, I know that I was terribly bored with studying German law in Germany. I wasn't a great fan of the very deep doctrinal analysis that you do as a student of German law there. I was always more interested in social theory and history and comparative law. So I did study history while I was studying law. I just didn't finish the degree because it then, drew me on to do more specializations in the law rather than finishing my master's. So I spent a year after studying law in Germany in London at the London School there was this London University, and was at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and the University College of London. And I studied there Chinese and Soviet law, which is a way to date myself. That was in 1988, 1989. And I went to London to study Chinese law because I was simply intrigued by the fact that so many Chinese scholars came to Germany in the late 80s to study German law. And I felt, you know, this country is in a such different position. And just the fact that at some point in its history, it had adopted Japanese law, which itself comes from Germany, doesn't mean it's a good fit. So I was always interested also in sort of the fit of institutions to circumstances and to the social setting in which they happened. And that brought me to London to go to the School of Oriental and African Studies, and somebody suggested then I should add Soviet law. So I did, and then of course, 89, Tiananmen happened, and I came home to Germany and the wall fell. And, you know, these are sort of external circumstances that bring you to make certain choices. And my choice was then in the end to focus on Russia. Also a language that I found more accessible as a, you know, German speaker. And so I studied Russian, and I went to Russia frequently just to internships in law firms, and then to start to investigate that. And when I went to the Kennedy School, that was basically the platform then to go back to Russia multiple times to do some field research about privatization and the development of legal institutions in that country in the early days of the 1990s.
Okay, very, very interesting path, and I remember this time, but maybe not many of the young scholars. I went on my interrail trip to Europe a few years after the wall fell. But did you then, like, through these practical trips, if I understand it, you were working in law firms, and then you did the PhD a little bit later, and then maybe the topic of your PhD. Can you link that to your?
Yeah. I mean, I spent a lot of time, you know, in Russia, but also in other Eastern European countries. And for those of you who remember those days, there were big debates about how fast, and if so, why, how fast to privatize, by what methodology to privatize. Companies in countries where most of the major production companies and of course the financial sector were all in state hands. And one of the things that really did this to my own thinking, I had to think about how our institutions really work. I mean, you don't really learn this as a lawyer. You learn sort of certain doctrinal questions, and you learn, you know, the legal rules, but you have to understand also the functionality of institutions to imagine what it is that these countries need to do if they want to embrace something like a market economy, a capitalist system, which as such, I didn't question at the time. I just felt this is the, you know, if they make these choices, then they have to do these things. If they want to privatize their companies, they have to think about what the legal and institutional infrastructure is that has to be put in place for this to work. And so I compared what was happening on the ground. I went to interview managers in Russian companies about what they did when they started privatizing, and I went to the Czech Republic and interviewed people there who organized privatization just to try to understand what happened. And so I had a lot of empirical material, which I ended up then using for a dissertation that compared the mass privatization in the Czech Republic and Russia.
Very, very interesting, and I can maybe point some of the young scholars to Isabella Weber's book on how China escaped the shock therapy. She was studying PhD at the same time as me, some 10 years ago, and that might be an interesting comparison to the story you are telling from the Chinese side. And maybe Jay, we should get her on some of the events in the future. Now, back to the plan, or actually another side story. I think I heard the story about Axel Leonhufvud being one of, that's known here, he passed away a couple of years ago, being one of the few economists on some big event. I have been trying to dig this up, but some old professor told me this story that he raised the voice that this wave in Soviet for privatization would become disastrous, and they laughed at him, or everyone in the room said that he was not getting it, but actually we found out some decades later that maybe Axel was right. And
I think he wasn't. It wasn't. It was him, of course. Well, it was a few others as well. Lots of lawyers, lots of sociologists, lots of students of the Soviet Union predicted that this wouldn't work. And I think it's not that hard to see why not if you begin to unpack our economic system. So I think the problem was that most of the economists who ended up advising the Polish or Russian governments, really had no sense of the institution of a market economy and a capitalist system. They just had a very idealized version of markets and felt that if you just take the state out, the rest will kind of follow. But everything from evaluating a company to governing it and making sure that the governance itself can be supervised or at least checked on by others has to be put in place, and it just takes a long time to build these institutions. And I think the quest for radical reforms, which was an ideological quest, blinded many economists against the need and importance of slowly building a new kind of system. And the tragedy is that many opportunities were missed to begin that process. And so in some countries, including Russia, this never really took hold. And the results, I think, we see today.
Yes, and even like 12 years ago in Berlin, the title of your talk was how to create a financial system that's socially useful, and I encourage to go back to that. That was fascinating for me, at least, to watch it again. I mean, the stupid question is, have we succeeded in that in 12 years? I mean, have we moved at all, or are we in a worse place than I mean, at that time we looked in the middle of the euro crisis that Stefan was describing with the target 2, just symbolizing, but like in the previous session, but like with everything that happened since then, saving of course the euro, but then having the pandemic that has forecast and the ongoing turmoil in the financial system, crypto, and the war affairs. I mean, what's your view today on social usefulness of the financial system?
So I don't think that we are any closer really to social usefulness. Of course, it always depends on how you define social usefulness. And I think it's true that since the 2008 crisis, we have made the official banking sector a lot safer in principle, although things like Credit Suisse happened nonetheless. I think we certainly have expanded the safety valves for the financial sector by the Fed in particular, but other central banks also stepping in whenever needed, and that's why we haven't seen major convulsions yet. So the capacity of central banks in particular, or finance ministers, to deal with emerging crisis has increased, but that doesn't end up give us a more socially useful financial sector, which I would understand to be a financial sector that actually channels financial resources to where they are most needed, and not only where they make the highest returns. I think that's the basic confusion that we have in many assessments of economic viability, that is mostly about the financial returns it creates, rather than the question of what are the other benefits that might not be expressible directly in financial returns that you could get. So inclusiveness, access to finance for households that are unbanked, the use of purpose-driven finance rather than only profit-driven finance, etc. So I don't think we're much closer. I think there are more people thinking about this today because people started thinking about this after the financial crisis, and they have concluded that we need to do more work on that. And I think that's productive, will be productive in the long term, but the dominant system is still a very different one.
Mm-hmm. And then on this talk where I interviewed you first, you shared with me the keynote speech you had on that conference, and that where I understood you presented the legal theory of finance probably for the first or one of the earliest time, because less than a year later the influential paper was out, the legal theory of finance, which I at least always link, or it helped me, and I think probably some other money viewers here, together with the toolbox from the balance sheets of Perry, to grasp and understand the financial crisis of 2008 that was influencing us in this time, 10, 12 years ago. Can you maybe like bridge for us, or correct me if I'm wrong, or seeing the thread from the Legal Theory of Finance paper 2013 to the Code of Capital book that you had 5 years ago, 2019, with the important subtitle of How Law Creates Wealth and Inequality. And then maybe towards the end, jump us over to the current work you're doing. But first I want to see or hear how you trace this 12 years ago to 5 years ago, the paper and the compendium with where Perry also had in the special issue, also had the FX paper, and then several others, INET people, over to the book of the Code to Capital, and then to the future.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just first also recognize that Perry was one of my collaborators in this project that led to the Legal Theory of Finance. And as you mentioned, the Journal of Comparative Economics has a special issue where also his own contribution to the project appeared as that of several others. So what I had done, and maybe I should just say a word about this, I think that after the financial crisis, I felt that we didn't have the intellectual analytical framework to understand and diagnose the crisis in all its dimensions. And the simple reason was that nobody had predicted a crisis, of course not its timing, which you can't ever do, but nobody had really seen that this what was coming. Some voices at the very end, of course, but Raghu Rajan, etc. But we know these stories. But essentially, it hadn't appeared to people in the early 2000s that this was in the making and actually sort of advancing relatively fast. So I felt we just had to rehash rebuild our intellectual building blocks to understand how this financial system operates, why it crashes, and under what conditions it crashes. And that led to the Legal Theory of Finance. And essentially my perspective, and that was basically building on the research projects that my collaborators did, one on money for Perry, some on sovereign debt, some on credit-based finance and consumer credit in particular, some on derivatives. And for each of these market segments, we had two perspectives usually, one that came more from an economics perspective and another from a more sociological perspective. And by unpacking these different sectors and how they crashed in the run-up to 2008, I felt that there was a very strong common denominator, and that was the law. And the law not as sort of a top-down dictate, this is how we basically, in a creationist fashion, design a financial system, but the law in its private law dimension, which is people, individuals, private actors can fashion their own legal and financial relationships in the law by availing themselves of contract and property rights and collateral and trusts and corporate and trying to manipulate the bankruptcy rule. So that became very much apparent to me in this research project, and the Legal Theory of Finance basically says as much. It says a financial system is a legal system. It's every financial asset is an IOU, and it is an enforceable IOU, because if it wasn't enforceable, you couldn't trade the stuff at scale. So you have to have the state in there, and you have to have the coercive powers of some state, not necessarily one particular state there, for financial systems to even operate at that scale. But of course, then also because everything is in law and it's built on legally enforceable rights and claims, if everybody tries to enforce their claims at the same time, the system will necessarily collapse, because the promises are made on a future. There's more promise than there's money to go around, and it crashes in the end. So after the paper, I just, took a second look at the institutions that we, unpacked. And especially when you think about, complex derivatives, they all have fancy names, collateral debt obligations, credit default, swaps, all that stuff. When as a lawyer, you unpack it, you see stuff that you have known for centuries. There's trust, right? There's contract law, there's property law, there's collateral law, all that you need to fashion these financial instruments. And so my first inclination was just to say, well, let's take a look at what these things have done earlier in history. So basically, I started writing a history of each of these institutions. Where did the trust come from? What about collateral? How were these things structured over time? Where were important moves made? And then I realized along the way that probably only legal nerds like myself would find that particularly interesting to follow like the institutional details. And so I felt I should probably write a book that uses the stuff that is coded as law, like land and debt and firms and scientific knowledge, and show how that actually is coded, can be coded in law, and through the legal coding strategies actually becomes a wealth generating asset or capital.
And then if I may try to link it then also to there is a book that you co-edited with Oliver Schutter from 2015, Governing Access to External Resources, that I became recently quite interested in. And I point students to that. You can find it actually in open access on Columbia University Press website. So you don't buy it on Amazon for $60 like I tried to first. But the resources we were talking on Paris keynote speaks before for the fourth prize of money on inflation issue, and the resources and commodities are an important aspect there behind, and also from the privatization story from Soviet or any other global South country or whatever, where you have the resources, your state assets, and you have privatization demand from the capital providers from the north. So could you link maybe a little bit to this book from what we have talked until now?
Yeah, I mean, so far we've talked mostly about maybe the financialization of economic relations and the role that law plays in that. And I think sort of the commodification, capitalization are all sort of parts of that story. Another thing that I've always been interested in is sort of the reimagination, how to reimagine property rights and how to, first of all, simply realize even our existing legal systems that the Blackstonian despotic dominion of exclusive rights that are allocated to single owner is just not exactly how our regimes work, but the ideology, of course, has a lot of power. But we also, like Olivier and I, wanted to sort of recast the debate and say a little bit, talk more about how we have to think about ways in which we have to make sure that everybody has access to essential resources. We use land and water as the primary examples in that book, and we brought together scholars who, researched on those issues and wrote papers for us. So it's an edited volume. But our quest was really to say, what we have to think through is not how to allocate property rights to create the potential for the greatest gains that you can make, because you invest in it and you reap the rewards, so you invest even more. But in our world, and of course climate change was happening back then already, but more generally also for questions of social justice, we have to think about access to essential resources. And what essential resources are and how you create access channels might differ from society to society, but we were trying to find a way to create a more abstract common framework to think through those issues.
Yes, and then if we are towards the middle now, so if we, I mean, there are 2 points I have. One is like, in a way, similarity from the money view or the ancestors there that Perry is building on, and what I read from your material is that it's this bridge between the practical and the theoretical. So the money view is now trying to create new theoretical foundations for the macroeconomics, but it's building on the old guys like Minsky or even older, who had like one foot in banking or in practice, and then trying to theorize it. And the same with the money view or the Coursera course of Perry. It's the practice of Wall Street, the traders, the money market functioning, and then theorizing about it and trying to put up a system around it. And how I read you is also, that you are and then it's tracing into your current book project that I've heard briefly from 2 podcasts, and I'm trying to figure out, like, you are trying to build up some new theoretical legal foundation for capitalism, or like, yeah. So
well, yeah, I think so. I think in general, I think Perry and I share maybe what I would call like an inductive approach to theorizing. I think, you know, Perry has been a deep student, of course, of the big thinkers about money and credit relations, but also about I think looking at what, you know, central bankers do and bankers do has been part of what he's been doing. And I basically do the same for lawyers. I look at what lawyers do and how they contribute to the project of, in this case, of course, credit and money creation. And in that sense, I think it is very closely related. I guess, you know, if you want to put this in metaphorical terms, you know, Perry, at least sort of in, you know, in sort of the writing I've studied most, he's talking very often about the plumbing of the system. And I think sort of in terms of anatomy, this would be like the bones and maybe with the bones and maybe the blood vessels of the system. And I would basically say, well, we also have to go down to the DNA, right? We have to think about the genes. And I think where I see the law is making sure that the information is transmitted about who has priority rights on what kind of boundaries are being drawn around different types of asset pools, what legal tools are being used for that. So I find it very, very much complementary, because my perspective on the law, again, is also not one that thinks of law, and I think that's just the reflection of how our legal systems operate. It's not a top-down creation by the state. It's never been that. Of course, we have at some point adopted constitutions, regulations, and the administrative state have that flavor, but our private legal order, and by inference also our financial system, apart from the regulations that try to push it in one direction or the other, is actually a bottom-up system that is supported nonetheless by the law and by the authority of the state. So I do study a lot, you know, institutions, do comparative law, and I talk to lawyers, and I'm sort of an inductivist. I study also theories. I think that you have to do both, because as an academic, you want to generalize from what you find and generalize in a coherent fashion. So you also have to know how other people before you have done that. So in the book project that I'm currently trying to finish, so maybe I can do this before 7 years, but I'm not sure, is called, I just renamed it Capitalist Law. I think the title that had been proposed to me, and I was writing it for a series of books on law and political economy. The title was like The Laws of Capitalism. And I thought, in the end, what I'm trying to say, is there such a thing as capitalist law? And so what are the features of capitalist law? And that raises then also the question, could there be something that is law but not capitalist? I would certainly argue that there can't be capitalism without law, because I've put down that argument in the Code of Capital. But the question is, could we think about a system beyond capitalism that still has law? Because I think complex societies need something like law. And I think the Marxist prediction that state and law would wither away under communism was utopian, and I don't see that utopia any nearer today than it was 200 years ago. So I think we have to think about systems that are complex, governed by relatively abstract concepts and rules that help form collective expectations amongst market participants and others. But could it be non-capitalist? That's the question I'm asking.
Yeah, it's maybe too early to find out whether it could be a system like that. I mean, let me link it to some current affairs, like we see from even the Constitutional Court in Germany now, telling even the politicians or the finance ministry, you cannot spend more. You have to follow the debt break rule that you put in place. You cannot use the COVID money from the European Union. I mean, what are we like in my reading of that through Financial Times? I mean, I'm not reading German media. How are we seeing the jurisdiction, the legal system, and even the courts affecting, not only companies or private affairs, but even on a like state-run affairs and making the economical situation of a country worse, putting the farmers on the streets to protest. I mean, am I taking it too far there?
Yeah.
Or but you mentioned the constitutional.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, I think it was a major mistake by Germany to put the debt brake into the constitution. That was silly. And that was done in a particular political moment. But then once you've done that and you take a constitution seriously, then that has to impose constraints on that government with all consequences. And I think that's just the way a democratic political system bound by law functions. So I wouldn't want to have a political system or economic system where basically say the chancellor can do whatever he wishes or she wishes. That makes no sense to me either. But I do think that a debt brake is a silly idea, especially for a country like Germany. I think probably for most countries it's a silly idea. So I think that's where I see the problem, but everything else follows. There's some other silly things that happened in Germany. We can continue that is who can bring a case to the Constitutional Court and how has the Constitutional Court expanded access to it and to particular quest for controlling the government. That can also be deeply criticized. So I think there's always like a chain of events and a chain also of legal maneuvering that brings us to the state of affairs where we're in. But it basically, I think, reinforces what I'm saying. Our systems are deeply coded in law, capital for sure, but our systems in general are deeply coded in law. That's the way in which we're trying to control government, right? We have a constitution, we have checks and balances, we have a constitutional court. Now, not everything then works exactly as you might have imagined, but sort of the interplay of different strategic moves that actors within the system make. And they also try to alter the rules or reinterpret the rules so they fit their needs. The end result is what we're seeing, and that's very often perplexing and maybe not ideal, right? But the alternative, would have to be either a system where you just dispense with these kind of rules, and that makes little sense in my view, or you have a system, and that we haven't invented yet, but maybe we should, is where we also have like a kind of a meta level of governance where we consider the interplay of different legal moves that have been made, and then reconsider how we can untie the knots that we're creating through that very system. But once you have like a relatively decentralized or you have multiple levels at which legal change happens and strategic moves happen, it does necessarily create these impasses where, and it's difficult to get out of them. You would have to basically have another constitutional majority, 3/4 in Germany, to change the constitution to get over the debt break in the constitution. And with the liberals in power, that is very unlikely right now, right?
And that's just one example of many I think we are seeing currently. So around both Europe or in the globe, I mean, we have the depth in the global south coming towards the IMF. We have a lot of like upcoming legal disputes on many levels. How do you view like the current state of affairs? I mean, for me, it looks like since the financial crisis of 2008, we've been like in constant crisis mode with few like periods of small relief in between. But we had the European sovereign debt crisis, we had the Euro crisis, and then we've had also these Crimea and the war effect, the pandemic 2020, and now with several things happening on several places around the globe, and they are all playing in from politics and legal and financial side. So how do you view the state of the world now, from like working on a book on capitalist law and with the practical side happening, so trying to maybe not make an autopsy of a rabbit that's running around with many damages? How are we to understand the world we're living in now from your perspective, where you sit?
Yeah, so I think I think so the most positive spin I can give to the state of the world, which is not so positive right now, is that, you know, crises are always moments of change and innovation. And so I think we have been in a prolonged crisis. I would even start the crisis before 2008, which was just like the peak of something that we're building for quite some time already. But I think we have been in a prolonged crisis and we don't really know how to get out of it. But you never get out of it by grand design. You just don't. I think there's, however, at the same time, a lot of innovation happening. And part of the innovation is the role that central banks have been playing. And you can say this is maybe politically not what we want necessarily, because it's also supporting a system, a financial system that perhaps should have crashed. But the sheer scale of that financial system and the danger of allowing it to crash has basically, you know, I think made policymakers hesitate to let that happen, because in the end, you find yourself back in a situation like in the 1930s with the, you know, banking system collapsing and 25% or more unemployment, et cetera, right? So those costs have to be avoided. So I think in 2008, certainly I thought we absolutely have to avoid the crisis. Now looking back, I think, you know, the system is even more blown up than, or sort of, you know, sort of it's even bigger now. So letting it crash today is even harder. But at the same time, we also have lots of new technologies and lots of new strategies. So if the central banks had or were willing to learn the lessons, let's say, from COVID, that somehow the central bank must be able to reach every household in society to make sure that they can survive in a pandemic or survive in a financial crisis. Let's say we create wallets for households with the central banks. Then next time the financial system basically presents the put option, bail us out or we blow up the financial system, you say, well, blow it up. Because at least we can provide payment for everybody. We can basically create basic security. Still doesn't make for a happy ending because many assets will lose value, but you basically provide an insurance. I'm not saying that they will do this. Political obstacles are in the way, but we have a technology now that makes it much more feasible for having a payment system in place and building it so that it's it can be put in place if and when needed. And I wished, I'm not sure it's happening, but I wished maybe not the central banks, but the treasury, the political institutions were to put such insurance systems in place. There's also a lot happening in a more decentralized fashion. People are starting to think again about new forms of banking or old forms of banking, including public banking or mutualized banking. New business organizations are emerging. The idea of, you know, basically thinking not only about maximizing profits, but of other purposes that can be put into the charters of corporations, and then you call them public benefit corporation. All of that is happening on a small scale, but it's been happening over the last 15 years. And I think so again, if I'm typically a skeptic and a realist, but in my more positive moments, I try to look at all the stuff that actually is emerging, and see also positive signs of hope. And when I think about big transformations in history, then that's how they happen. I think a revolution, or it's just the tip of the iceberg. What is really important, what's happening beneath that, the institutional changes, the new strategies that take hold. Ideally in multiple domains of social life at the same time, or they overlap or inspire each other, so that we find new forms of organizing both economic relations, social relations, but also political relations.
So good, you are optimistic, and would you use the same on the climate disaster that we have to solve parallel to all these other ongoing things? Or
well, I think the climate.
Are you touching on that?
Yeah, no, I think climate disaster is is presenting capitalism with something that capitalism has always ignored, which is that there are boundaries in the system. Social systems don't expand forever, and certainly not if they are themselves dependent on a bounded biological system. And I think that's the conflict that we're currently facing. And the question is basically, will we learn fast enough to let go of capitalism, or will we allow capitalism to blow up our climate first? And I think realistically speaking is probably that capitalism will blow up our climate before we get anything else done. My hope still, especially for younger generations, is that we can learn enough that we can retool the system. And here again, interesting things are happening. Just that typical, we all point to the same cases of little hope, but still hope. Shell company being held liable by courts in the UK and the Netherlands for damages caused by their subsidiary in Nigeria on really old-fashioned legal doctrine. They basically use the duty of care. They set aside sort of the doctrines that had always prevented attributing damages or liability for damages to the parent if the subsidiary had done it. And they just said, no, if it's, if it's part of your family, basically you have to stand in for liabilities. If we could expand this, right? And I've made elsewhere and repeatedly also the call for saying we have to set aside limiting liability for investors who invest in known polluters. So that would be, of course, a major legal act, but could also be done through the courts. So there are a lot of ways in which in a relatively decentralized fashion, you can shift expectations and maybe thereby also influence the way in which people strategize their behavior. Will this happen fast enough? No, I think we're really in a race here, and I'm skeptical about that. But it's not that that nothing is being tried. I think at the political level, everything is a stalemate. If you move below that, I think a lot of things are happening, and I think that's where also change will have to come from.
Okay, and maybe we will get some instructions from the capitalist law book on how to do that. Or
I just see a question in the chat on what is capitalism. So I define capitalism as a system that employs social resources for the creation of private wealth. And the most important social resources that are used is the legal system on the one hand and the money system on the other. That's where I think Perry and my work is basically joined at the hip. But it's a social resource, and because a law operates only at the social level, it's not a commodity. You need the authority, legitimacy of the law. You need the enforceability of the law to do this, but you need exactly that to also code capital, because otherwise you can't scale markets and you can't protect wealth once it has been generated by basically asking the help of the state to do so. And I think the money system in the end also requires some kind of apex institutions that ensure that at the very end, liquidity can be provided and you can maintain the different claims in the system, or at least recycle them for a bit more to retain the system. Both of these systems are critical for capitalism. So for me, it's a system that uses social resources for creating private wealth. And the book about capitalist law is not another critique just of capitalism, but I'm trying to really distill the question, is there such a thing as capitalist law? And there have been debates about this in the past, right? So in capitalist system, most people would argue the only law that exists is our law, and that, I would say happens to be capitalist, because that's sort of the normalization that happens. But in the 20s or in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a big debate among socialist legal theorists about what is socialist law, if there's such a thing, and certainly what is capitalist law. And some were really insightful. I like in particular Yevgeny Pashukanis, the first Soviet socialist legal theorist, who was liquidated by Stalin, because Pashukanis actually insisted on what Marx and Engels and others had said, that the state should wither away. And obviously for Stalin, that wasn't a great prospect. And so he lost his life. But he wrote a book which was meant to be a theory of socialist law, but was really a critique of capitalism, where he said, one of the defining features of capitalist law is the duality, or he says it's the antithesis of public and private law. Always of the coexistence of these two bodies of law that are in tension with one another. That is deeply characteristic of capitalist law. And I think that he has a point. He really has a point there. So I think that's one of its characteristics. And perhaps one way to move beyond capitalist law is to make sure that even if we have, functionally speaking, different bodies of law, that they all adhere to the same normative foundations.
So that links well into like the ending questions I have of maybe books that were important reading for you during your either studies or this history of writing these books, and pointers to some PhD students on the call, and maybe let's start with that, and then there are some activities on the chat. Maybe we should open Jay for a few questions if you have time, but otherwise we wrap it up in the next 10 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't rattle down a whole long list of books, of course, one reads, but I think I probably have been deeply influenced by Max Weber, especially by his legal sociology, which is the only part of his economy and society that he authorized before he died an untimely death at 57 from the Spanish flu, actually, which is also something I hadn't known before. But he has many flaws, but he also was a close observer of institutions and of the evolution, particularly the evolution of and trying to understand institutional change over time, which I found really important. Obviously, sort of my interest in transformations of the former socialist world or the transformations of capitalism has a vibe with Polanyi, the studying of transformation, and Polanyi too pointed to many legal things, right? The abolishing of the Elizabethanian poverty laws, the breaking down of the guilds. These are also legal institutional changes that set in motion a complete transformation of societies. That kind of work I found always just deeply interesting for me. There are many other, more contemporary institutionalists. Geoffrey Hodgson, learned a lot from him. Catherine Thelen and the work that she has done together with Wolfgang Streeck and others on institutional change, different forms of institutional change, and using also political economy approach to some extent. Paris' work on money I think I learned a lot from him. The New Lombard Street, and of course the predecessors like Minsky, of course, and others. And Minsky himself has a big chapter on legal change in his 1986 book on how to stable the unstable economy. And he himself says, I don't know enough about law, but we should change antitrust law. We should change corporate law. And I kind of found it courageous for an economist like him to put down a blueprint. And I could go on, but that you just get a little bit of a flavor.
Yeah, and then I think I can maybe make you into a money viewer if you are building on Minsky like most of the people on this call. But I'm more or less through the big questions on my list. Of course, I'm trying to keep it like structured around this framework. But is there any, like, we could go deeper into it, whether the neoliberalism is that, or whether the capitalism is an institution, or things like that. But like, let's maybe think about that until some future talks. But is there any? Yeah, do you see this as evolving into, if I'm grasping the threads from your answers until now, do you see the possibility of developing like parallel systems, like that there will be more than I mean, now we see both. I'm very much European centric, where how the European Court of is influencing corporations, and then we discussed the Constitutional Court, and then you are mentioning how we need to transform the system. Do you see like a parallel systems of different legal systems or tools or platforms evolving? I mean, there's a possibility